But that also brings us to another historical development that took place beginning in the 19th century, and that is the search for the historical Jesus. Now, at its base, this quest for the historical Jesus is based on both the ideas of Unitarianism, the ideas of Jefferson's skepticism, the skepticism of the Enlightenment. Essentially, the idea is that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth who existed, who lived, who died, who serves as the basis for the Christ of theology. So people who were engaged in these quests for the historical Jesus believed that there was somebody who actually existed back then, who later had a whole bunch of things said about him, that he was the Messiah, that he performed miracles, that he rose from the dead. But those were things that, excuse me, that were added later in this view. And so the goal of the historical Jesus was, what can we say about the historical man, Jesus of Nazareth, before all of these other things were said about him regarding him being the Messiah rising from the dead? So a very skeptical assumption. And so throughout the 19th century, the 20th century, there were various attempts made to try and claim that certain things could be separated from the Gospels to find out who the historical Jesus was. Now, one of the things that was pointed out in the early 20th century that I think is a very important aspect of this. So as these theologians, both in the 19th century, the 20th century, there's still a few of them in the 21st century, as they have attempted to, in their minds, separate fact from fiction in the Gospels and try to find the historical Jesus, often the historical Jesus that they have found tends to look like the person engaged in the quest. All right, so if I am engaged in trying to find the historical Jesus and separating fact from fiction between Jesus and Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus Christ, well, if I happen to be a Marxist or an anarchist, or I happen to be, any of a variety of philosophical positions, well, it just so happens that Jesus was that way too. Right? Jesus was a Marxist. He was against the oppression of the lower classes, and his preaching was all about economic freedom and the trying to escape the power of the middle class over the lower classes. Now, was there that aspect of Jesus' preaching? Yeah, he did talk about the poor and some things related to the poor and where they fit in the kingdom of heaven. But was Jesus a Marxist? No, he wasn't a Marxist. Certainly, yes, there were some elements within Jesus' teaching that line up with a more communistic type of approach, right? He's talking about sharing. And he's not denying private property, but he's talking about sharing, right? So it's just a little more communal, perhaps, than what we think of it today in our capitalistic society. But he wasn't a Marxist. But often these historical Jesus theologians, it's like they look in a mirror trying to find the historical Jesus. Oh, well, Jesus just happens to be what I happen to be. And so that often takes place in these things, let alone the question of, can you actually do that? You know, can you actually, quote unquote, separate from fact from fiction? I mean, you're automatically assuming that there is fiction in the Gospels. So that in itself kind of subverts the whole thing. So, you know, a lot of people in this kind of post-Enlightenment, 18th century, 19th century, thinking that certain aspects of Christianity were not rational, they sought to find what they could believe to be rational, and that wasn't just, you know, issues of stories and things like that, but it was also about the nature of Jesus. They weren't the only ones rethinking aspects of Jesus' life in the 19th and into the 20th century. One of the things that develops throughout the 19th century was sentimentality, romanticism. Right? Romanticism is a philosophical movement that develops as kind of a response to the Enlightenment. A lot of thinkers began to feel that the Enlightenment had overemphasized reason in the mind, had abandoned things like the emotions. And so there's this swing the other way with a very emotional approach to philosophy, to art, to poetry, and of course to theology as well. And so you have this development within Christianity, certain types of Christianity, of this very nostalgic, emotional, very relational approach to Christianity that we might call sentimentality. And that's evidenced in a variety of things. The preaching of the time, the artwork of the time, and of course the music of the time. Songs like "What a Friend We Have in Jesus" is written in the latter part of the 19th century. The songs like "Blessed Assurance," you know, where the focus is more on emotional approaches to God, the focus is more on individual relational understandings of God and Jesus. All right, so that instead of Jesus being some cosmic lord, some divine human, colossus that strides throughout human history, he's a friend. Whilst Christians certainly have talked about love, the loving relationship between Jesus and the individual is emphasized, so that you have this more sentimental approach to Christianity, where it's about the kindness of Jesus and the love of Jesus and the concern of Jesus. And this is reflected in, like I said, the way sermons are said, talked about with Jesus, songs, those kind of things. Now there's still, other expressions of the nature of Jesus. Jesus is king, Jesus is ruler, Jesus, in all sorts of other expressions that we've seen and could see throughout history. On the other hand, in the early 20th century, there's kind of a response to that. Right? And so some men feel that the development of sentimentality, when it comes to this kind of sentimental approach to Christianity, is that such approach has made Jesus weak. And so there's this shift to talk about Jesus more in the context of being the man's man. So in the 1920s, an advertiser, a marketing guy, writes a book called The Man Nobody Knows. And in that book, Jesus is presented as kind of a very astute businessman who is, he's this strong, he's not weak, he's very masculine, and this type of Christianity becomes known as Muscular Christianity. So the idea is that Jesus had been made too feminine in the 19th century, and now there's this attempt to kind of reclaim Jesus for men, right? Because the assumption is there are no men in Christianity. And so presentations of Jesus must be more manly. And so, the attempt to enlist sports figures, again, we're talking about the early 20th century, but you have some of these baseball players turned preachers talking about Jesus, Jesus not being a softy, but Jesus being a man's man. There's a lot of interest in other aspects of Christianity that are reflective of this, about trying to make Christianity more appealing to males. And so the transition that takes place is not just having sports figures be preachers. It's also about changing who Jesus, or how Jesus is depicted. And so there's this transition as well. You have these kind of two competing views of Jesus. Jesus, like the good shepherd, is he my friend, or is he this strong, muscular, powerful business person, out there, playing hard, those kind of things. Both of which, continued throughout the 20th century. Both of which I think, that we would see today. In more recent years, there have been additional understandings of Jesus, and what you see in the late 20th, early 21st century is an attempt to kind of take Jesus and, kind of separate him from Christianity. And so some of this is coming out of the historical Jesus quests. Some of it is coming out of developments in the 60s and 70s, where you have this kind of merging of a hippie lifestyle with this drug culture, free love, but getting religion, right? The hippie culture getting religion. So you have these people like Jesus freaks, as what they're called. They're teenagers, they're young adults in the 60s and 70s who are active in evangelizing people. They've adopted some of the hippie lifestyle, the long hair, the loose clothing. Some of them living in communes where, the drugs are, there's no drugs, there's no free love like you would have in a traditional hippie commune. But you have this, adopting Jesus into the culture of the time. And this shows up not just with these people that are committed to evangelizing this more traditional form of evangelical Christianity. Popular songs are written about this. Jesus shows up in a lot of the folk rock of the time, in songs and those kind of things. So there is this element of, Jesus subtracted from Christianity. And just, wanting to connect with Jesus, but not really concerned about the church, institutional religion, those kind of things. You also have, this connection with Jesus and the celebrity culture, right? So coming out of this Jesus freak culture, Jesus kind of becomes this ultimate celebrity in the way people talk about Jesus. Well, this develops into a variety of pop culture expressions of Jesus in musicals, in movies, other types of expressions, one of which would be Jesus Christ Superstar, musical that essentially kind of takes some questions about Jesus' identity, who is Jesus really, and superimposes it on larger questions within the later 1970s about gender, about race, about militarism, imperialism. There's all sorts of things where Jesus kind of, it's less about Jesus and his identity and following and obeying Jesus, and it's more about Jesus serving as a cultural critic for where the United States is. And that's in a variety of pieces, Jesus Christ Superstar just being one of them. But there's still, of course, the more orthodox presentations of Jesus. In 2004, Mel Gibson released The Passion of the Christ, which was meant to be a more orthodox presentation in contrast to some of these others. Essentially, though, The Passion of the Christ is a meditation on the Stations of the Cross from the Middle Ages. The events of the narrative of the Passion of the Christ follow along with the events that are a part of those stations. And in many respects, you know, songs like Jesus Is Just All Right With Me represent a certain time period in the 1960s and 70s. Jesus Christ Superstar represents the 70s. The Passion of the Christ, I think, represents, of course, our post-9/11, darker, more challenging period, because it is a very dark film. There's a lot of focus on the violence of the crucifixion. There is, of course, unlike with Jesus Christ Superstar, right, the narrative follows essentially the last week of Christ's life in Jesus Christ Superstar and ends with the cross. The Passion, though, ends with the resurrection. Right? It's just a very brief period, but there is that resurrection of Jesus. So in recent years, Jesus is more of a figure that fits into pop culture in a variety of ways. In addition to the muscular Jesus, the sentimental Jesus, Jesus is King, all those other kind of things that we've seen before. So why does any of this matter? Right? Okay, well, all right, now that we've gone through all this, we have an idea about the history of how Jesus has been viewed. Well, I think it matters in a couple of ways. First, I think it matters because it does tell us that while we might think we approach Scripture and read Jesus out of the Bible, right, and encounter Jesus, okay, I have a relationship with Jesus, so much of our culture shapes how we think about Jesus. So that we have to ask ourselves, when we have thoughts about Jesus, who Jesus is, what my relationship with Jesus is, we should ask ourselves, well, is it truly something biblical that I have here, an understanding I have here, or has something else shaped my understanding of Jesus? Right? So it should call us to a recognition of, the external forces that shape our understanding not only of Jesus but a variety of things related to Christianity. Secondly, I think it calls for us to really kind of consider, some of the things that we say about Jesus, and are they truly biblical, or are we saying something we really don't want to be saying? Right? It's like, when you think about some of the theologies that we looked at early on, are those? These were people who honestly were trying to come to terms with understanding who Jesus is, the nature of Jesus, as well as the nature of what he did. But sometimes, of course, that leads into error, and so that calls for us to reflect on our views of what Jesus has done for me, my understandings of who Jesus is, and those kind of things. So while we can't answer some distinct questions like, how is Jesus both God and human? Does he have one will? Does he have two wills? Is he one person and two, all those nature questions? We can't answer them. However, what happens is when we tend to emphasize one over the other, we go in those errors. Right? So it reminds us to try to be careful when it comes to these extremes. Because when we emphasize one over the other and focus only on one aspect, ignore the other, then we go into these heresies. Finally, I think it matters because it's encourages us to meditate more fully on Jesus, who he is. Yes, we can't come to the answers, but simplistic answers are certainly not enough. Right? And so we have the opportunity, we have to be careful, but we have the opportunity to grow in our relationship and our understanding of Jesus. And then I think out of that, a greater appreciation of who Jesus is. Out of, reflecting on maybe some of these questions and those kind of things. We shouldn't over-intellectualize it, right? I mean, that's the problem of the Enlightenment. And really those early centuries. We over-intellectualize some of those things and go into intellectual errors, but we can also go into emotional errors if we go the other way. And so loving God, loving Christ with our heart and our mind, I think is a reminder here, and then the appreciation we can have for that. So I think that what I hope that this brings out is a greater appreciation for who Jesus is, the multifaceted nature of Jesus, while also recognizing that people have had some really important questions and they've struggled with that, and simple answers are usually not the ones to be found. But perhaps you have some other lessons that you think we can learn from this, or some other ways in which this would matter. And so feel free to bring this up in the discussion boards and to talk about it a little bit more fully in ways you think that some of this discussion might improve our relationship with Christ, or maybe you would disagree. Maybe you say, no, this really isn't going to help me spiritually. And so feel free to bring that up in some of the comments as we go through the discussion boards this week.